Hi students, welcome back to my channel, Economic Lectures. Hope you all are doing well. In the last video, we discussed about the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem and the Heckscher-Ohlin model. And in the final slide, in the final part of the video, we also said that there are limitations or criticisms for the HO theory. So in this video, we are discussing two main criticisms or limitations of the HO theory. Okay, fine. So we call it as the empirical test of HO theorem. The empirical test in the sense that when we conduct real tests in order to prove HO theorem, of course, two main concepts, two main limitations or criticisms comes forward. That's why we call it as the empirical test. We title this video as empirical test of HO theorem or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Okay, fine. Let's go more into the topic. Some notable attempts have been made to empirically test the validity of Heckscher-Ohlin model. Of course, after any of the theory comes forward, many other economists put forward empirical tests. Empirical test in the sense that we will test the reality of that theory by applying it into the real economy. We will first present the results of the original empirical test conducted by Leontief. The first one was Leontief, an economist who conducted his own study, and then the issue of factor intensity reversal. Another issue, the first issue was put forward by Leontief. The second issue is named as factor intensity reversal, which is prevalent, would lead to rejection of Heckscher-Ohlin model. So this was just an introduction. We'll go deep into the topic. Fine. The first one is Leontief paradox. So who is Leontief? Leontief, Wassily W. Leontief. He is an Russian-born American economist, and in the 1950s, he studied the U.S. economy closely and noted that United States was abundant in capital and therefore should export more capital-intensive goods. As per the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, we said that a capital-intensive country should export capital-intensive good and a labor-intensive country should export labor-intensive good. On the other hand, the country will import a good which is scarce in that country. That means if the country is capital intensive, we will export capital intensive good and we will import labor intensive good, and the vice versa happens. So Wassily studied about the US economy and found that US economy is a capital abundant country, and thus it should, in reality it should, as per the theory, US should export capital intensive good. However, his research using actual data showed the opposite. But his data, his empirical study showed the opposite result. The United States was importing more capital intensive good. So what happened is that his study proved that his real data study proved that US was exporting capital intensive good and it was importing US was exporting labor intensive good and it was importing capital intensive good. So the opposite of HO theorem is working here. In 1953, Wassily Leontief published the result of the mainly renowned experimental investigation in economics, an attempt to test the reliability of the HO model with the US trade patterns. So what was his intention? The intention of Leontief was just to test the validity of HO theorem. He was not against, or he was not a critic of HO theorem or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. He just wanted to prove it empirically, and he conducted the studies and he published it. According to the proportions theory, factor proportions theory, the same as HO theory or the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, the United States should have been importing labor-intensive goods. As per the theory, it has to be the US has to import labor-intensive goods, but it was actually exporting them. US, even though being a capital intensive country, it was exporting labor intensive good. His analysis became known as Leontief paradox. So what does this word paradox means? paradox in the sense that something opposite is proven. Something opposite is proven. That's what paradox means. Something that creates confusion, something that creates doubts. That's what paradox means. So his analysis came to be known as Leontief paradox because it was the reverse of what was expected by the factor proportions theory. So the reverse factor proportions theory, we know that how the theory works, but what happened is that the opposite of that has happened from the study of Leontief paradox. For this test, Leontief used his own invention named an input-output table. He created an input-output table and calculated the amount of labor and capital in the US export and import substitutes. So he created an import-output table and he calculated the imports and exports of the United Nations, and along with the amount of labor and the capital used for those imports and exports. The results of Leontief test was startling. It was surprising. US import substitutions were more than 30% more capital intensive than US exports in 1947. His test was really based on the year 1947, and it was proved that the imports of US was 30% more than yeah, US import substitutes were more than 30% more capital intensive. That is, the imports of US was capital intensive than the US exports. US was importing more capital intensive good than exporting it. So that what happened is that actually, as per the theory, US should be importing labor intensive good. But what happened here is that US is importing more capital intensive good and exporting more labor intensive goods. That is, US seems to export labor intensive commodities and import capital intensive commodities. This paradoxical result, which was the opposite of what Heckscher Ohlin theorem predicted, came to be popularly known as Leontief paradox, as we said. Okay, fine. In the same study, Leontief tried to rationalize his result rather than reject HO model. So Leontief paradox was not for rejecting the HO theorem. He was a supporter of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. But what he tried after getting the result is that he tried to rationalize his result, and he gave some of the explanation from his side itself. He himself has given two explanations for this paradoxical result. The first explanation is that since in 1947, US labor was about 3 times as productive as foreign labor, what is said is that when it comes to US labor, it was 3 times more productive than the labor from other part of the world. So that was the reason why he got such a result. So being labor more productive, more goods are made by them, so it seems that labor intensive commodities are more in the country, and that's the result why US is exporting labor intensive good. Another reason, second reason put by him is that the second explanation given by Leontief for the paradoxical result is that the US stays are biased strongly in favor of capital intensive commodities, resulting in higher relative prices for these commodities in the US market. So what is said is that the citizens or the people that live in United States are more they wish more for capital intensive good, or their taste and preferences are more for capital intensive good. As the demand for capital intensive good is increasing, the price is also increasing, and thus if they were exporting capital intensive good, then its market the price of such goods in the international market will be more, and that was the result how capital intensive good due to increase in price was not exported, and on the other hand labor intensive goods were exported. Therefore the US would export relatively labor intensive commodities. But Leontief's explanation of his own paradox has not been accepted by the others. But other economists did not accept his explanation. What they said is that One possible explanation of the paradox is that the year 1947, which Leontief used for the test, was too close to the World War II. One of the explanations given by other economists is that the year in which he conducted study, that is in 1947, the year was very close to the Second World War, and it was because of that reason in that particular year or some years following 1947 that the capital intensive goods were exported, because labor was in more use than the capital because of all sort of destructions all over the world. Another reason, a more general reason for the paradox, is that Leontief used a two-factor model, thus abstracting from other factors. We know that there are mainly four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. But Leontief also used only labor and capital. Only he also used only two factors of production, and he skipped other factors, other two factors of production. And economists say that it is because of this reason that Leontief got such a paradox. It is also said that the most important source of this bias was the fact that Leontief included only physical capital in his measure of capital and ignored human capital. When it comes to capital, capital can be divided into physical capital and human capital. Physical capital in the sense that machines and all tools, everything comes under physical capital, whereas there is also another side of capital, that is human capital, the knowledge that we have. An engineer is a human capital. Of course, he has the knowledge of engineering and his knowledge can be used in that sense as a capital. So another reason said by the economists is that Leontief considered capital as only physical capital and he did not take into consideration the human capital. Since US labor import is more human capital than foreign capital, adding human capital component to physical capital would make US exports more capital intensive related to the US import substitutes. So what the other economists said is that as Leontief did not consider human capital, so if the US economy is more of human capital, that means people with knowledge, people with education, people with skill is more. So human capital is more in American economy than physical capital. So Leontief should actually have uh, combined the physical capital and the human capital. If we do so, then the economists say that then of course the exports will be more capital intensive than the imports. All these comments suggested that the Leontief test is not strong enough to disapprove the Heckscher theory. So all these things put forward that the Leontief paradox is solely not enough to reject Heckscher-Ohlin theorem or the HO theory, and basic hypothesis of the HO theory appears to be valid. So when considering the Leontief paradox, we can say that the HO theory is valid. So that's what comes under Leontief paradox. Another criticism or limitation of the HO theory is factor intensity reversal. So what is this factor intensity reversal? Let's look forward. According to Heckscher-Ohlin theory, HO theory, the pattern of international trade is determined by factor endowments and factor intensities. As we said, the amount of factor and the intensity of factor, that is the factor endowments and the factor intensities determine or draw the map of international trade. So when capital is more in one country, when labor is more in another country, and in that way the international trade occurs. But changes in relative factor endowments and factor intensities are possible over time. The thing is that this factor intensity or factor endowments will of course change over the time. India at present is a labor intensive country, but with development, being a developed nation, India will change into a capital intensive country, of course. That's what we can see all around the world. All developed countries are capital intensive rather than labor intensive. All second world and third world countries or the underdeveloped or developing countries are more capital intensive. Some other countries are more intensive in other factors such as raw materials. They are more intensive in raw materials when it comes to African countries. At present, they are more intensive in land or raw materials. So in that way, by time, the intensity of factor of production or the factor endowments will keep on changing. A crucial assumption of HO theorem is that the production functions are different in different countries and they are identical for each good in two countries. One of the basic or important assumption of the HO theorem was that the production function are different for different commodities. Of course, that's a reality. The production function for one commodity will be different from the production function of the other commodity. But they also said that the production function of one commodity, for example, commodity A, both countries will be making commodity A. So the production function of commodity A in both countries will be same. The production in a country, there will be commodity A and commodity B. So the production function of both commodity A and commodity B will be different. In the other country, in the second country, they will also be having commodity A and commodity B. The production function will be different for commodity A and B. But Heckscher and Ohlin along with that says that the production function of commodity A and commodity A in first country and commodity A in second country, the production function of both countries for the same commodity will be same. That is, the production function will be identical. That is, one country is capital intensive and the other commodity, that is, one commodity is capital intensive and the other commodity is labor intensive. But the same commodity which is capital intensive in one country must be capital intensive in the other country also. And the labor intensive commodity remains labor intensive in both countries. The thing is that, for example, here in India we make steel. So the steel is capital intensive commodity, but we are not capital abundant country. The steel is a capital intensive good, but we are not capital intensive country. We are labor intensive country. On the other hand, in US also the production of steel is capital intensive. Steel is a capital intensive commodity. Along with that, they are capital abundant country. Capital is more here. Steel is a capital intensive good, but we have less capital. But in US, steel is a capital intensive good and they have more capital. So as per HO theorem, HO assumption, Heckscher-Ohlin theory assumption, the same good will be capital intensive in both countries and the same way good will be labor intensive in both countries. Factor intensity reversal refers to the situation. So what is factor intensity reversal? It refers to the situation where a given commodity is labor intensive commodity in labor abundant country and capital intensive in the capital abundant country. If the opposite of assumption or if the opposite of the assumption of HO theory happens, that's what factor intensity reversal says. The thing is that a given commodity, for example, steel. Steel is labor intensive in a labor abundant country. For example, if steel is labor intensive in India, that is in a labor abundant country, and steel is capital intensive good in America, in US, which is a capital abundant country. So what happens? The same good is labor intensive in a labor abundant country and it is capital intensive in a capital abundant country. So what happens in that situation? According to the HO theory, both countries will come into an international trade when when one country exports capital intensive commodity and the other country when one country exports capital intensive commodity, the second country will export labor intensive commodity, so both countries can benefit. So what happens in factor intensity reversal? The country that exports factor in abundant factor, so the commodity, the country that exports capital intensive commodity, that is steel. On the other hand, the second country will export labor intensive commodity, and in that country steel itself or the same commodity is capital intensive in one country and the same commodity is labor intensive in another commodity. So they will have to, one country will have to export the same commodity, the other country will be also exporting the same commodity. That is the situation. For example, if you have any doubt, just go through this example and it will be clear for you. Factor intensity reversal is present. So when will the factor intensity reversal will happen? If commodity X is uh, commodity X is labor intensive in country 1. For commodity X, one commodity is labor intensive in country 1, that is it is a labor abundant country, and at the same time it is capital intensive commodity in country 2, that is country 2 is capital abundant country. So what happened? The same good, for example, let's take the example of clothes. In India, cloth is a, for example, labor abundant, a labor intensive commodity. More labor is used than more machines in India. And we know India is a labor intensive country, and India cloth production is what, a labor intensive. Cloth is a labor intensive commodity, and India is a labor abundant country. So what India will do? India will export clothes. On the other hand, let's take USA. In USA, cloth is a capital intensive commodity because more machines are used for making clothes. In USA, cloth is a capital intensive commodity, and of course US is a capital abundant country. So what will happen? India is a labor abundant country and cloth is a labor intensive good, and India will export cloth to you. India will export cloth to USA. India will send clothes to USA. And in USA, cloth is a capital intensive commodity, and USA is a capital abundant country. So US will export cloth, or US will send clothes to India. So what happens when such a situation comes? That's what factor intensity reversal says. We can use the concept of elasticity of substitution of factors of production to explain the factor intensity reversal. This elasticity of substitution of factors can be used to explain factor intensity reversal. Just go through the points. The elasticity of substitution measures. So what does the elasticity of substitution measures? The degree of the ease with which one factor can be substituted for another another factor in the production. For example, we are using 10 labor and 5 capital for production of one cloth. So what happens when we are substituting 2 labor? That means we are decreasing 2 labor and we are increasing capital. So we are increasing from 10, we are decreasing capital into 8. So we are substituting the 2 labor for the capital. So that's what the elasticity of substitution is known as. So when we are substituting 2 capital as 2 labor, how much capital we can use, how much amount? That's what we know that theory, elasticity of substitution. The factor intensity reversal is likely to take place. When does factor intensity reversal takes place? If the difference in the elasticity of substitution of labor and capital is greater in the production of 2 commodities. So when we are taking 2 commodities, so the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital is more in the production of 2 commodities such as steel and cloth. In any country, steel and cloth, the substitution of labor, the elasticity of substitution will be more. Elasticity of substitution of factors, labor and capital, between labor and capital will be more because both commodities such as steel and cloth are extreme commodities, not in any way related. So when we are substituting labor and capital from one production of one to the other, that means the elasticity of substitution is more. It's not easy to substitute. If country A is labor abundant and its wage rate is low, for example, if country A is labor abundant and its wage rate is low, it will produce clothes through labor intensive technique. We know that. the country B, which is like capital abundant, and the wage rate of which is higher, where if country B is capital abundant, then its wage rate will be higher, will produce clothes with capital intensive technique. That's what we said in the factor intensity reversal. In this situation, there is a reversal of factor intensity, as cloth is labor intensive commodity in country A but capital intensive commodity in country B. We are just repeating or revising the same point. Similarly, steel is labor intensive commodity in country A but capital intensive in commodity B. If factor intensity reversal exists, if this exists, the HO theory breaks down because country A would export clothes, its labor intensive product, and country B would export clothes, which is capital intensive product. So if a factor intensity reversal exists, if that's a reality, then HO theorem breaks down. The HO theorem is not valid. Since the two countries cannot possibly export the same homogeneous product to each other, the HO theory does not remain valid. That's what factor intensity reversal puts forward. We discussed two topics, the Leontief paradox and the factor intensity reversal. Both of these are the limitations or the criticisms that's put forward by economists when it comes to HO theorem or the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. So hope that all points are clear. You can clear your doubts through my mail, which is given in each slide. Then my email is aminamsai@gmail.com, or you can comment your doubts below the video, and of course I'll be reaching out to you. Thank you. See you in the next class. Hope you will share, like, and subscribe my channel and suggest the videos to your friends. Thank you. See you in the next class.